Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Amanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development webinars. So it's a 21st February International Mother Language Day. आलमी मादरी बोलने जो डी यहाँ है so इन हवाले से असांजी webinar I'll be sharing languages. So teacher development webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online PD to connect people from all over the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to old normal of face-to-face conferences. And we are celebrating International Mother Language Day webinar series. International Mother Language Day webinar series aims to celebrate linguistic diversity and multilingualism. We intend to promote awareness of equity and inclusion in education through discussions about linguistic human rights, importance of mother tongues, language sensitization, and other concerns about language. And now for this webinar, importance of mother tongue in English classroom, we'll consider how we can incorporate more classroom tasks that involve going back and forth between English and mother tongues as part of spoken interactions, reformulating content from written English to mother tongues and vice versa. We'll reflect on the role that mother tongues, community tongues, and other tongues such as English play in shaping who we are and what we will become. Now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Dudley Reynolds for this webinar. Dr. Dudley Reynolds is co-area head of arts and sciences and teaching professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University, Qatar. He served as president of the TESOL International Association in 2016 to 2017 and has been a teacher and researcher of multilingual language learners for over 30 years, working primarily with learners of English. His research addresses language education policy, developmental patterns in additional language learning, curricular and pedagogical approaches to literacy development, teacher education, and learning. We are pleased to have you, Dr. Dudley. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars and happy International Mother Languages Day.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with everyone today on this truly day that we should all be celebrating, which is International Mother Language Day. And it is an honor very much not only to be speaking to you today, but also to have the chance to be part of such an incredible series that you have put together. And I hope that what my talk today will do is to build really on the foundation that has already been laid with the talks that you've hosted this past week and the talks that are coming up as part of this series. And I thought it might be helpful to kind of step back a little bit and think about what that foundation is. And I was especially glad to see that the very first talk in this series was one by Zubair Tawali on the endangered language of Torwali, which is spoken in an area of Pakistan. It is spoken by a small group, relatively small population, and it has traditionally not been used as part of the language of schooling in that area of Pakistan. But of course, his work and the group that he works with has been dedicated to changing that reality, if you will, and showing how it is possible to teach what are often referred to as mother languages or in endangered languages, minority languages, indigenous languages, as part of a multilingual school environment. And with the goal of language, we often say revitalization. I feel like as long as the language is living, then maybe we should be talking about it as language vitalization. And that this is a goal that we should have for all languages. And of course, the approach that Zubair illustrated is one that's often referred to as MTB-MLE, Mother Tongue Based Multilingual Education. And it's an approach to education that argues that school children should begin learning in their mother tongue, right? That is the base. And that they should begin learning, therefore, in a language that they understand best and most. And there are many reasons for this, but I think the second talk by Dr. Amar Mahbub really sort of brought home why that is so important. Amar gave examples from his own inheritance, from his own mother tongue, what he referred to as his boli, and used those examples to illustrate or really to open our minds about what is language and how what language does is that it represents social relations. It represents understandings that are developed within social contexts. And because that is what language is, language, in a sense, is a way in which we represent our understanding of both the social and physical world. And that is why it is extremely important, therefore, that we build and strengthen multiple mother languages, because each language, in a sense, has the potential to represent the world and see the world in different ways. And so when we have access to multilingualism as individuals, we also have different ways of knowing. Therefore, we have a wider range. And I think that this is, it really illustrates when we talk about the richness of diversity, right? That diversity is not a problem, but rather a wealth. And Amar really drove that home in his talk with multiple examples. And then on Friday, we had Kashif Raza's talk on that really sort of moved this conversation into the classroom. And he gave us illustrations from his own classrooms of what he referred to as multilingual pedagogy, and how, in contrast to what we often think of as traditional views of language classrooms, where languages should be taught in isolation in order to sort of avoid any corrupting influences, if you will, from other languages. Kashif gave us a number of really practical examples of how we don't have to see languages in competition, but rather in that as part of a collaborative environment, and how really anything new that we learn as language has the potential to build on what we already know about languages. And that we should see that previous knowledge not as competition, but as a strength, as something to build on and draw on. And of course, just as a preview to our audience today, and I know Ala, you've been pushing this out as well, but mine is not the last talk in this series. And I'm really happy to see you've got 2 more talks coming this week, and I think series further talks after that. And again, I think we're building more and more on the notion that we need to rethink how we bring mother languages into the classroom. And this deals with specific techniques, like Xiaofeng will be talking about, which include translanguaging, which is a term that is very popular today. Many people are talking about it, and many people are wrestling with the notion of what does it look like in the classroom? What is its value for the classroom? And so I look forward to his talk, and as well as Amal Padwad's talk on diversity in the classroom. And I think I'm really looking forward to that one as well, because he does acknowledge that this is something new for us, and it is, or something that it's not new as a reality, but it's new as something that we are thinking about. And for many people, it does raise issues and concerns that we need to think through. And I noticed yesterday you've got some even more talks following these 2. And so I encourage everybody to visit the website here. For my talk today, I want to, again, build on many of the themes that we see expressed in these other talks. And I want to begin with the notion of, why do we care? What is it about this notion of mother tongues that why do we think they're important? And then why do we think they're important, if you will, in the classroom? But before we get to mother tongues in the classroom, I want us to think a little bit, and this is where I hope I can push people thinking a little bit today, about what is the goal of the English classroom today in 2021, all right? What is its purpose? What is its social function? So let's start with this notion of importance. I think Zubair's talk illustrated and made us stop and think about a statistic that UNESCO and researchers have really been driving home for many of us recently, which is that 40% of the world's estimated 6,700 languages are in danger of disappearing. Think about that for a moment. Languages are in danger of disappearing. And if we think about what Amar told us, that languages are a way of knowing, a way of seeing the world. And they often represent different ways of seeing the world. When we lose those languages, we lose that knowledge. Okay? That's not something that I think any of us want to see happen. And so we need to think constructively about how we prevent that from happening. And one of the reasons that that is happening around the world is that while there may be somewhere between 6,700 to even 7,000 languages remaining in the world, the number of languages that are actually used in schooling is much, much less. It's less than 500. In fact, I've seen estimates somewhere between 200 and 300 languages are all that are used as part of schooling. Now, not only does that pose a threat to those languages, that also means that as many as 40% of the global population, okay, does not have access to education in a language that they speak or understand well. They are excluded from our educational system because their languages, their mother tongues, are not included. They're not used in schooling. And it's that realization that has given such importance to work like Zubair is doing and other groups around the world. And so I think, those 2 points are ones that I take very seriously as a teacher of English. And I take them seriously because English, the teaching of English, is today so prevalent in school systems around the world, such that we often see school systems in countries that have great linguistic diversity adding English classes before they add classes in mother tongues. And I think we have to really question the wisdom of that move. And we have to step back and say, wait a minute. Do we want to be teaching English at the expense of another language? And I would argue that at least I don't. And I would hazard to guess that many of the people on this talk today also do not want to be seen as teachers of English if that means that their students are losing other languages, right? And so our challenge is to think about how we develop English and abilities in English in collaboration with, as Kashif pointed out, the teaching and learning of other languages, right? And I'm arguing here that I'm building on an argument of Robert Phillipson and others who talk about the ways in which the teaching of English has been really for the past half century a form of linguistic imperialism, and really longer than half a century. It goes back as, in a sense, an artifact of colonialism, which has a much longer history. And so what I would like to challenge us today is to think about how we can counter this linguistic imperialism of English. Yeah. To explain a little bit more what I mean here by this notion of linguistic imperialism, I share this characterization from Phillipson of how English has been, and he uses the word instead of taught, he's used the word marketed in the world. And I think that that's the right word. And he says English has been marketed as a language that everyone needs and that everyone should learn. He says this is a myth of what we call global English. It is blithely proclaimed as the lingua franca of science, of business, of integration in the European Union, of international understanding, as if other languages also cannot bring international understanding. He argues even more that English is fraudulently projected as a language that does not belong to territories, and in particular, territories in what we call the global north. English is marketed as if it can be disconnected from where it came and the driving forces of expansion worldwide. It is, and he says, in other words, English has been, in a sense, the language of globalization. But we are now realizing that globalization itself is a false universalism. Now, there's a pretty strong critique of English today. And it is, but I want to argue today that it is, what he's really critiquing is one rationale for why people around the world should be teaching and learning English. But it's a very powerful rationale that has affected how we teach English. And for many policymakers around the world, it has been behind the idea that really English is all a student needs to know. This is an ideology that I see when I go to the grocery store here in Qatar, a country that as soon as you hear me say Qatar, you think, oh, that's an Arabic-speaking country. And yet when I go to the grocery store, I hear parents who to me look Arab, speaking with a different accent from my accent in English to their young children. And I think, why? What's behind this? And before you say, oh, they shouldn't do that, I'd like you for a moment to think about your own classroom, right? And I've put just a table here on the slide as a grid to kind of drive your thinking. And I'd like you to think for a moment that there are three kinds of language being used in your classroom. There is language that you use with students and students use among themselves as they're entering the classroom, as they're leaving the classroom, or when something funny happens in the middle of class. That's language that builds social interaction. There's also language that is used to manage the classroom, to give instructions. It may be class, be quiet. It may be everyone pull out your textbook. That kind of language. It may be a student explaining to their friend, no, turn to page 50. And then finally, there is the language that we most closely associate with building competency in English, all right? This may be a reading that students are analyzing, picking apart. It may be sentences that they're filling in the blank in, whatever it is. It may be a reading that they're supposed to then talk about. If we think about where this language comes from, we look at the rows, and some of the language comes from us as teachers. Some of it comes from students. It's produced by students. Some of it is, if you will, existing in the classroom, either through a textbook, through materials, through posters on the wall, whatever it is. But if you divided the language in your classroom into these sort of 9 cells, if you will, it's 3 by 3 matrix. And for each cell, you characterize them as, well, this primarily occurs in English. It primarily occurs in another language. It is, in fact, mixed between English and one or more other languages. What picture emerges of your classroom? And I think we need to bear in mind two sort of pictures. One is the picture that is reality. And then there's also the picture that nagging voice in the back of our head tells us should be the reality in our classroom. Let me go back to my previous slide. Is English all we need? Is English all that is used in your classroom across all 9 cells? Should English be all that is used across all 9 environments? My guess is that many of you do have other languages used in your classes, but they're primarily in the first 2 columns. They rarely will occur in the 3rd column. And I'd like to question if that's correct, if that's the best today. And now I want to move into why I think we should be questioning that. Recently, my daughter, who is studying art curating in university, shared with me a book that one of her professors had been part of writing. And I found it very, very provocative. The title of it was Curating, so curating art after the global, roadmaps for the present. And the thesis of the book is that the field of art curating had become something which was very entangled, if you will, with globalization. And so increasingly art exhibits and biennials and art festivals were being responsible for bringing contemporary art from all around the world together in places.
Maharaj,
So, I'm gonna, if somebody, I think somebody there, thank you. Pause just a second. So that art was being seen increasingly as a part of globalization and as something which was promoting this sort of homogenization that often goes along with globalization. And so the description on Amazon reads, it's become commonplace to talk of a globalized art world and even to speak of contemporary art as a driver of globalization. This universalization of what art is or can be is often presumed to be at the cost of local traditions and any sense of locality and embeddedness. But need this be the case? The contributors to Curating After the Global explore practices and roadmap for the globalized present. The thesis of the book is that the period known as globalization, the historical period is one that can no longer be sustained. That in the face, at the time they wrote this in 2019, of climate change and the dangers and the damage to our climate that's being brought by global trade as well as global travel. In the face of increasing resistance in nations around the world, what some refer to as neo-nationalism and others even as neo-fascism. And we have to only look at the recent history of my own country, the United States, to know what they're talking about. That the era of globalization is in fact over. And I think that since 2019, the pandemic has even driven this home even more. That where we saw the world going, the world is not going to be able to get there. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you think it's not. Whatever, I would argue that this understanding of English allowing everyone, everywhere to communicate easily with each other is simply a marketing device, and it's not going to be reality. And therefore, we, as English teachers, need to think about what teaching English after the global will look like. What are our roadmaps for our present? I think the first thing that we need to realize is that while many of us call ourselves English teachers, we in fact are teaching multilingual individuals to be multilingual. And we need to take that job seriously. The world is ever more diverse. Tobek's work and Blumert and others who've written about superdiversity argue that it's not just people who speak 10 languages living in the same city. It's that people themselves are so diverse. Everything from having the people in an urban area, some are citizens, some are not citizens, some are considered legal residents, some are considered illegal residents. Some are intending to be there for a short time, some are intending to be there for a long term, right? Some come from educated backgrounds that they gathered in other places, others are picking up their education locally. Communities are diverse in ways that, and on a scale that we have not seen hither before. Others, such as Aronin and Singleton, refer to multilingualism as not a phenomena of borderlands, but rather the new linguistic dispensation, the new linguistic norm for the majority of the world. We also see, as Kashif brought in his talk on Friday, that even our notion of language has been deconstructed. Many people don't talk about or recognize that when they try and talk about language in plural, languages, what they're really talking about is collections, repertoires, and that the repertoire of any individual in this multilingual, super diverse world often has resources that have been collected and brought from multiple places, multiple social environments, multiple kinds of interactions. And we have within the field of TESOL, this, I'm not saying anything new when I talk about needing to teach multilingualism. If you go back to 2014, we had two different books, one by Stephen May and then by Conte and Meyer, both of which use the phrase the multilingual turn in TESOL as part of their titles. And so this is where the field is at, okay? At least conceptually, at least theoretically. But going from theory to practice takes time. And I think where many of us around the world are today is trying to figure out, okay, I get it. I am teaching multilinguals. I want them to be multilingual. I don't want them to be monolingual English speakers. But how do I do that? How do I do that? So that's sort of where I want to go for the rest of this talk. What is it if we're teaching someone to be multilingual, what is it multilinguals do? Well, first off, they do not learn languages as a baby learns a mother language, right? A baby who learns a mother language is in a sense starting with nothing more than the way in which their brain is wired, right? They are starting with a cognitive disposition to recognize patterns that they are exposed to, but they don't have any previous patterns. People who are developing as multilinguals, however, already have patterns. They already know that there are situations where we greet, there are situations where we give orders, there are situations where we express distress. And they have techniques for doing all of those things. When they become exposed to a new language, they are layering new techniques onto old, right? And they're going to use those old patterns. They're also very aware of how people use languages interacting. One of the things that we know from studies of children who grow up in multilingual homes, so where the first patterns that they hear are actually from what the world considers to be different languages, is that those babies can figure out which patterns to use with which parent, right? They can distinguish. And so one of the things that a multilingual is very, very good at is knowing when they can use the resources of Tagalog versus the resources of Spanish versus the resources of English, right? And they know when the person or the environment is one where they need to be monolingual. It's one where they know that when they can shuttle back and forth, when they can speak translingually, all right? And so this is something that monolinguals are very good at. They can read the world, if you will. A third thing, though, that multilinguals do is that they act as intermediaries. They are what has often been called in the sociolinguistic literature brokers. They are language brokers. And a lot of the work on this idea of language brokers has dealt with a very specific situation, which is the situation that children of migrant families often find themselves in, which is they get sent to a school in a new country. They pick up the language of the new place in that school through peer interaction, through ESL classrooms, or whatever kind of classroom you've got for new arrivals. And they quickly, because they have this sort of very intense exposure, they pick up that new language faster than their own parents do. But there comes a moment when the teacher needs to speak with the parents. And so the parents get invited to the school, and the child ends up becoming the broker between their parents and the teacher. They are the intermediary. And the parents then realize that the child, in a sense, can help them in the world. And the child may be then translating for the parent in a government office, right? When they're trying to get some kind of social service, or at a hospital with a doctor, right? So there's been a fair amount of work researching language brokers in this particular context. But I would like to argue that we need to broaden our understanding of the language broker and begin to think about the fact that multilinguals frequently serve this role where they are a bridge between communities. So let me just sort of describe some tasks that I think may be fairly common in the world of multilinguals. And I know, and I'm guessing that many of you are multilingual. I'd ask you to think about, do you do these things often? So one environment is that often we will have meetings, especially if we are in a business setting in what's today called a multinational corporation, or that somehow that the multilingual finds themselves facilitating a business meeting, right? And essentially what's going on here is that we have individuals as part of this meeting who are very competent with one language, but not necessarily competent with the other languages in the room. But then there's somebody who is competent in both and is facilitating, is going back and forth. I would argue that competent multilinguals often find themselves in situations where they have access to information. Take, for example, a brochure put out by the WHO about vaccines. And they consult this brochure in order to try and argue and convince an elderly, more monolingual relative that they should in fact get the vaccine, why it is safe for them. So they've learned about the vaccine in one language, and now they've got to use that knowledge in another language. Synthesizing knowledge. Maybe we're working on a report, right? It's a report that has sections that both deal with the local context as well as international models. We need to synthesize knowledge. from multiple languages in order to generate this report. Many of us engage in tasks that are simply described as translating, right? Where it's extremely important not to get just the gist of information, but to actually do word by word, unit by unit, going from one language to another. So something like a research survey. Often, my own children were lucky enough to go to what were called international schools. And I'd go to meetings at the school where teachers or leaders would be giving a talk to all the parents, but find themselves needing, they'd speak in one language and then they'd stop and they would give a brief summary of what they had just said in another language, right? So they're going back and forth as part of an oral presentation. I think they're also, let's don't just think about the mundane, let's think about artistic possibilities. And really some great examples out there of artists who are able to draw on meanings and connotations from multiple languages to create art forms. I encourage you, there's a YouTube video about a multilingual poetry slam in Australia. Fascinating to watch these artists creating products that draw on multiple languages. So these, I think, are actually fairly common tasks for many people in our world today, especially people who are what we might call advanced multilinguals, highly competent multilinguals. What I now ask you, how many times do you have tasks like this, any of these, in your English classroom? If your English classroom is in fact teaching multilinguals to be multilingual, should it? I'm coming near an end here and I'll be taking questions soon. I want to just share a resource that I worked on a couple of years ago for an NGO here in Qatar called the World Innovation Summit for Education, WISE. And it's a report that I referred to that was titled Language Policy in Globalized Contexts. And so while it is more oriented towards policy, it is something that I try and sort of convince people that this is a good policy by helping them to envision what that policy might look like in reality and in the classroom. And so in the latter chapter of the report, I argue that if we are to teach individuals to be multilingual, right? To learn multilingualism, here's how it needs to impact. Here's how it needs to change. I would argue that first, as teachers, we have to have an open stance. We have to make it very clear that it is okay to use multiple languages in our classroom. But not only should we license it, I think we need to model it. Because our students look to us as models of language use. And even when our ability to use multiple languages is the set of languages is different from the set of languages that our students bring to the classroom, right? We can still model. We can still talk about what we do when we want to use Spanish or French, if that's an extra language. It doesn't always have to be just the language that our students are learning or developing. And finally, we need to design activities that look like some of these tasks, right? Many of us have tasks in our classrooms where students have to synthesize input from multiple sources. But how often are those multiple sources in different languages? But those are things we as teachers can do. As we begin to think about what students have to do, we want them to be making connections between languages, seeing where they can borrow a strategy, for example, that they've already learned, or even, oh, this new language does it like this other language I know. But we also want them to be able to realize when it's different, to differentiate. We want them to be able to accommodate multilingualism, right? To have strategies for what do they do when they don't know how to say it in the new language. We also, and I think this is most important, and especially as we come back to this notion of the importance of mother tongues in the English classroom, we want them to realize that that mother language is part of their identity. It is part of what makes them unique. It is part of what is their inheritance, as Amr said. It is part of their wealth. I want to close today with a quote from Ofelia Garcia, who many of us know in connection with her work on translanguaging. And it's a very, very powerful quote to me. She says, how can a reconceptualization of language, and especially of the narrow definition of academic school language, promote education that would validate and shape the experiences of all students so that they can retrieve them to construct knowledge for the future? How can schools help students reach into their linguistic past to build a linguistic future as educated human beings? How can we liberate language from the shackles in what it has been kept in schools? The importance of mother tongues is not just about heritage. It is not just about the past. It is absolutely essential if we are to prepare our students to teach after the global. Thank you. And I'll now turn it over to you to moderate some questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dudley, for this insightful talk, and especially coming from you on such a day like International Mother Language Day. It really means a lot. And you know, what a wonderful review of all the previous webinars and ideas. So yeah, so I'm seeing this question: what is your stand regarding standardized English exams like IELTS, TOEFL, TOEFL? So don't you think these days already discriminate those whose native tongue is not English?
So while these tests are ones that are made and designed for individuals who did not learn English as a mother language, right? If we're talking about TOEFL, IELTS, etc. we do need to understand that they are not tests of multilingual ability. They are tests of a set of resources that are part of multilingual competency. I think one of the great unexplored areas in assessment research today is how do we begin, for example, to identify individuals who are good at being language brokers. I don't know of a standardized assessment that does that well, right? And yet I don't understand why it couldn't be, right? That if we begin to think about and we adopt some of the theory of language testing, and so Lyle Bachman, for example, talks about parameters for describing a language usage task. Well, what if that task is a multilingual task? So I think there's a lot of potential there. Okay, another question?
Yeah, so there's another question. If you could suggest some of the references you of modern language.
Yeah, let me, I believe that I have, let me quickly, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. And where'd it go? Okay. And simply because I do want to show you that I do have, as part of the slideshow, the references that are used in the talk today. Amanullah, I've shared the PowerPoint with you. I can share it as PDF. And if you want to post it on the website, the Facebook page, that's fine with me.
That's great. We'll do that.
And also people can simply send me an email and I can send the PDF as well. And I'll type my email in the chat box.
Great. So the floor is open for questions. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat box if we have any other questions. So there's a question, what about sign language? Do you consider it as a universal language?
Yes, sign language is a mother tongue, right? And in fact, English is an additional language for individuals who first learn language via sign language there. And so I think it's important and I think sign language is also a really good example of how knowing different ways to communicate, in a sense, stretches our brain in different directions. It helps us to see strategies for representation, for making meaning in different ways, right? And I think that that's a very good example there.
Muhammad Hamani says, how about the negative language transfer? So I don't know what he means about.
Remember that one of the things that I talked about as part of what does a multilingual individual do as they learn or develop to being a multilingual is not only do they see when things are done similarly, they have to figure out when things are done differently, all right? And so what many people talk about as negative transfer is really just an instant where somebody is borrowing a pattern because they haven't figured out the necessary pattern in a new situation, right? And so what we're helping them do is to say, this pattern works, this pattern doesn't work in the new setting. But to my mind, borrowing from, if you will, something you already know to fill a gap in your knowledge, that's smart. It's not negative, right? It's not bad. It's a reasonable strategy and an important strategy. Okay? It is not something which slows down development of the new language. And this is where it's extremely important to go back to that the term that Kashyap used in his talk on Friday, and it's something that I talk a lot about in the report for WISE, which is that in the brain, what we think of as languages collaborate, they work together, okay? And it's not that this quadrant of my brain belongs to one language, this quadrant belongs to another language, and if I grow this one, it causes problems for the first one, or vice versa. No, it's not that simplistic. It's not, what's going on in our brain is not simply a competition for space. There are many, many ways in which knowledge builds from, collaborates with earlier knowledge. Yeah.
So we have this question from Olaskin, if I'm not, pronouncing here now. So how should we implement mother language into teaching English classrooms, although modern language teaching requires using target language and facilitating activities in the target language?
So I would be careful. So if I understood the question, one of the claims was that modern language teaching is something which is done without recourse to other languages. I would argue that I would question that claim. Now, it is a claim that I learned in graduate school when I was working on my PhD. It is something that I know is possible because I have done it for many years, right? Which is to teaching English without using other languages. And I've done it by, even with very, very beginning learners, by doing a lot of compensation and going very slowly to build patterns, all right, until things click. But I would argue that that was because I had a deficit, not my students, right? It was because I didn't know how to do it or help them get where they needed to go more quickly, right? I couldn't take a shortcut which would use some of what they already know because I couldn't speak that language. The problem is that and this is where the notion of linguistic imperialism comes in. The kind of English teaching that I learned in graduate school in a university in North America, right, where only English was spoken because that's all I could speak, right, is one which has then been pushed out to the world because of the resources of North American universities as the best model for teaching. And I would question that it's the best model. It's a model that works. It's a model that worked for me because I couldn't do it any other way. But that doesn't mean it is the best. And this is what teaching after the global will require, which is figuring out what is the best teaching method in your context, given your abilities as a teacher, given what your students bring to the classroom. You as teachers have to feel empowered to figure out the best way. Okay. Yes, you can look at my model as an example, but look at other models as well. Think about possibilities, be creative.
Okay, so Dr. Dudley, as we celebrate this International Mother Language Day, so what would be your last words and message to the world, especially educators?
What would be my message to the world today?
Yep, yep.
My message to the world is that mother tongues, mother languages are part of the richness and wealth of our world. And in order for us to counter everything from climate change to politics that sees the other as bad or dangerous, we have to bring the mother tongue back into all language classrooms. And we have to begin showing how we can collaborate, how we can work together here as teachers, and how languages work together peacefully and coexist in our world. We can't let one language be a threat to another language anymore. The stakes are too high. So I'll stop with that. And thanks so many people today. It's been a real honor to have a chance to interact and to talk. Thank you for your great questions. Please feel free to reach out or contact me. Okay. And I will be saving the chat and trying to go through some of the different messages that are in there. Okay. So
thank you so
thank
very
everyone.
much, Dr. Dudley. It was a clear and privileged to have you here on such a spacious day. And the notions you talked about, especially, all about those local languages, our mother languages, mother tongues, that we should not be, uh, leaving them behind or ignoring them at the cost of, one language. So yeah, I really appreciate your great ideas and participation in a teacher development webinar series about International Mother Language Day. Thanks very much. And for those of you who are interested to attend future webinars, you can always follow social media channels. This recording will be available on YouTube channel as well. So yeah, I will say goodbye. Thank you so very much and stay safe, everyone. In Sindhi, we say Jai Sindh, Jai Latif.
Shukran. Thank you.